Welcome to High Growth Matters, a podcast that explores topics on the minds of forward-thinking HR leaders and people managers, from leadership and strategy to emerging technologies. High Growth Matters is sponsored by OpenComp, makers of the world's first compensation software that gives you clarity every time you make a decision about pay. And it's hosted by me, Caitlin Allen, a startup executive with 3 exits under my belt, along with my co-host, Nancy Connery. Nancy was founding VP of HR and employee number 5 at Salesforce, and she now leads one of the most reputable HR advisory firms in Silicon Valley. She's also co-founder of OpenComp. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star rating as we dive in. When the business going gets tough and tough professionals get going, communication can easily fall to the wayside. And so in this episode, we speak with seasoned operator as well as personal executive and management consultant and coach, Don Raagas, about how the architecture of effective relationship and business building communication comes to be. Don is currently the VP of People Operations at Daasity. Don, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Me too. I love this topic.
Yes.
Before we dive into things, Dawn, would love to give the audience a chance to get to know you a bit personally. What is something that most of your coworkers don't know about you?
Yeah, so that's always a fun one, right? Especially those of us in the people roles, we're so used to talking about other people. And so when, I have to talk about myself, I'm like, oh, what do people not know that I want them to know? So I would say the biggest thing, or one of the things that nobody that I work with knows, is that when I got out of high school and I started college, I was putting myself through college, and I did that with a job at a bank. I started out as a teller, and then I moved into their credit card department. And you may be wondering, like, well, why is she sharing that? And if you've ever called into the credit card that you have, the 800 number that's on the back of your card, and had to, talk about your statement or anything like that, I was that person that people talked to. And this was way back before we had all of the conveniences that we have online now, where we don't really have to talk to people. So I guess you could say that was my crash course in learning really effective communication, because you can probably imagine the variety of people that I interacted with over the phone and had to communicate with. So that's a little bit about me.
I'm sure the word variety was used times.
Yes, I think that's the best word I can come up with.
That makes sense. Well, I think that's probably cooler than my first job, which was working at Starbucks. Although if we weren't going fast enough, I definitely think I got some variety in.
Yes. Another job where communication is key, right? And obviously the ability to make a really good latte, I think, also helps. So
it's true. Caffeine for the win. Well, great. Thank you for that. That was fun.
Yeah,
absolutely. And then maybe getting more to career topics. So you have had an interesting career journey that went from banking, answering questions, and then started in teaching, and currently has you in people operations with some stops along the way. So can you tell us a little bit about that journey and how it exposed you to maybe what we can call common communication breakdowns and breakthroughs?
Absolutely. Yes. So I did go to school to become a teacher. Did my undergrad, then did an additional 2 years to get my teaching credential. This was a long time ago. At the time, when I finished my credential, I landed in an environment that we were having, honestly, a hiring freeze for teachers. And so it made it really, really difficult to get a full-time teaching position. And as many can understand and appreciate, I think, we have rent to pay, we have bills to pay, student loans to pay. And so I didn't have the luxury of being able to wait around to get that teaching position. And so I had to pivot. And that was really what I call now the pivotal moment of my career trajectory, if you will, because it landed me into the tech space. And that was early on in the dot-com days. So I worked for a number of small startups. I worked for a publicly traded company. And learned a ton. That's where I really got my start in kind of the HR people ops sphere, if you will. And then as life, happened, I was at the point my husband and I wanted to start a family. And so I knew at that stage that for me and for our family, I wanted to have the flexibility to create my own schedule, to be the one that was able to be there, for our daughter. We didn't know we were having a girl, but now in hindsight, be there for our daughter. And so I, left my corporate job. I was on track to, I was on the VP track at that time. And so I took a huge risk and I left the corporate world and I started my own consulting business. And I just started taking whatever I could get, and people ask me, well, why didn't you specialize? Why weren't you just focused on one area? And I said, there are times in life where you really just need to take what you can get. And that was one of those times. And it was a blessing in disguise. I learned more through that experience in 15 years of consulting work than I think I ever would have learned had I stayed on the corporate track. And that's not to take away from those that choose that path, because I think there's a ton to be learned there as well. For me personally, I got the variety that I think is hard to come by when you stay on one particular track. That's why I'm able to have a perspective of operations, accounting, product development, just the full gamut of, business. And so that's really what led me to Daasity, to be honest. I was at the stage of my consulting work where I was looking for a new opportunity. I happened to come across Daasity when I was looking, at some different startups, specifically in my area. I'm in San Diego. They happen to be local. And that's really where my journey with them started. I interviewed. This is going to be, I tell the story to all of the new hires that we have, but I interviewed for a project management position that they posted because I read about them and I said, you know what? Yes, I can do project management, but I also can help in all of these other areas because I've been there and I've experienced it. And so what value can I bring to them beyond what they're looking for? And so I reached out. I got the interview, I met the co-founders, and, as they say, the rest is history. And so here I am today as the VP of People Ops. I started out with Daasity as a consultant, getting their project management set up. I moved into Chief of Staff. Again, that's a multifaceted role. And then realized, I do have this ability and this talent to bring teams together and to build teams. And that's what I've been able to do here at Daasity. So that's my professional life in a 3-minute nutshell, I guess.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and What I love about it, Dawn, is you've highlighted some very different roles and responsibilities, right? Like
Mm-hmm,
operations,
mm-hmm,
accounting, chief of staff, people,
mm-hmm.
program management, and yet communication is a commonality through it all. And
Exactly.
to your point about consulting being kind of an indirect blessing or gift,
Yeah,
I imagine you got to see trends in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise because you were working with so many
absolutely.
different organizations. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I that just the volume of data points is
Mm-hmm,
speaks there. Where would you
mm-hmm.
say communication usually falls down in a fast growing business, particularly?
Yeah, I think that there are really what I call kind of what I see as the top five areas that communication can really fall in. I hesitate to say fail, but it really does. It fails in these fast moving organizations. Number one is we make assumptions, right? We're moving so fast. We have one meeting or a couple meetings, and we just assume that the information we exchanged landed, they
Mm-hmm.
understood it, and also that they're going to tell the rest of their team, or they're going to, relay that information to another team. So we make assumptions. Another, number two is really around we never take the time to establish rapport with our employees. So if you can imagine, fast growing company, maybe you're hiring very quickly, or maybe you're just a small team and you're moving just really fast. And again, you don't pause long enough to build that rapport with your employees. Um, and what happens when you don't build that rapport or take the time to build rapport? That usually means you're probably not meeting with them regularly, right? That's number three. That's another place that communication can fail, because you're not having it, right? You're just not taking that time. And if you haven't done that, then you're likely not providing enough context, right? Around their assignments or around what's happening. You're not giving them the clarity so they understand where you're headed as an organization so that they can get on the bus, so to speak, and be riding along with you. And last but not least, when those four things don't happen, you haven't built trust. You haven't built trust with the people that are on that bus with you. And that makes it really, really, really difficult from a communication perspective. Um, so those are typically for me kind of the five areas where I see, or where I've seen over the course of my career, in working with multiple different startups as well as established companies, where communication can fail.
It's an interesting mix of interpersonal stickiness, so to speak, as
Yes.
it relates to
Hmm.
trust and getting to know people, and
Hmm.
then being clear in the details you give, and then also checking to make sure that the details that you wanted to landed around why and what.
Exactly.
What changes, if anything, about communication and its the areas that it breaks down during economic climates like we're in today?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we think about kind of this macroeconomic season that we're in, there's three major concerns, right? We're talking about we watch unemployment level, inflation, and economic growth, right? That's what's happening during the season. So how does that translate over into a company setting, and what are the things that we're faced with, and how do we navigate that from a communication perspective? Um, we have to be really, really clear and over communicate in this type of environment, right? We have to not make assumptions. Like I said before, we have to really remember that perception is reality for everyone on our team. So our perception, my perception, is likely different from your perception on certain things, right? We have to realize that. And we also have to realize that if we don't over communicate, if we're not transparent in our communication, our employees are going to create their own narrative, their own story. They're inundated with information, just like all of us are, right? Good, bad. Unfortunately, a lot of it is bad or negative in this type of a climate. So if we as an organization are not over communicating and being really transparent in our communication, they're going to create their own story of what's happening.
And I think too that kind of self-created narrative, it can scale from 0 to 50 or 0 to 60 a
Absolutely.
lot quicker too. So it's a
Absolutely.
really good point to keep in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine, to your point, you have a manager that's created this narrative because we as a company maybe haven't provided them with this transparent communication. So they create the narrative. They have a team of, say, 10. They share that narrative with their team of 10. The team of 10 then shares with their friends that are on another team. You can see how that can quickly spread in a way that's not going to be beneficial to the organization.
Yeah, it definitely can. And that's a really good reminder too. A lot of how people experience culture is simply based upon who they talk to most during the day. So when those stories go from one person to another, the communication all of a sudden can spiral one way or the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So one of the things I think that's endemic to your point about verifying that the way we want to communicate has been received in the way that we want it to be received is really understanding how to position ourselves to understand others. So yes. I'm curious, we're living in a season, I think, of what you called so aptly when we had our prep call of change and challenge, a season of change and challenge.
Absolutely.
And I would love to double click into how we can position ourselves to really understand others during seasons such as now.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it, right? And that is really starting with listening to understand. Mm-hmm. So often what happens is we as individuals, we listen to respond, right? Or we listen and wait to provide feedback, or in an intent to provide feedback, as opposed to just stop, just listen to understand what the person is communicating to you. And then, as I touched on earlier, remembering that perception is reality. So our perceptions are based on our individual life experiences, which means that no two of us are exactly the same. And so we have to keep that in mind when we are in, the season of change and challenge, because it looks different for everyone. And, last but not least, really practicing empathy. That truly is at the center of what I think has really helped Daasity in, the times of change and challenge, is that we are coming to conversations and communication with that, empathetic framework, honestly, and mindset.
Might be a dumb question, but for those of us or those people that are listening and they're saying, okay, great, I really want to learn how to be a good listener effectively to come at conversations seeking to understand.
Yeah.
What are hallmarkers that our listeners can look for, whether it's in their own conversations or if they're trying to teach their teams to be better listeners? What does good listening look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna hammer this one home because I think it's just critically important. Because I don't think that people are, well, let me step back. I think we live in a world where, because we are inundated with information so rapidly, that we don't inherently have that muscle to just pause and to stop and listen to understand, right? It's just not inherently how the world is operating. So again, I'm going to hammer that home. Start by listening to understand. That's number one. When you come into any kind of communication, just stop and listen. Number two, really, again, remembering that, it's important to be 100% focused. Remove distraction, right? When maybe you're on a Zoom, right? We live in this world now where Daasity is a 100% remote organization. Some are, some organizations are hybrid. So you've got some FaceTime, but we at Daasity, we're remote. So turn your Slack off when you're on a Zoom. You're on your one-on-one with with your colleague or with a team member, or direct report, I should say. Remove those distractions so you can be there and be focused and be intent. Use what I call mirroring or matching. And you can do this even in a remote environment. Maintain eye contact. Nod in agreement when you agree with what they're saying. Or maybe, when you're not clear, maybe you have more of an unclear look on your face and you say, I'm not quite sure. Can I ask you a question? It's that mirroring and matching the person that you're communicating with. Tone of voice is also something that's really important. If you're trying to get a point across and the other person is very, passionate, or maybe they're agitated, maintain that calmer tone of voice so that you can communicate more effectively. And restate what you've heard. Don't paraphrase, don't change words, like literally restate what you heard the person say and make sure that you're clear, right? That you heard what they said correctly. And last but not least, one of the most important things we can do as a good listener is leave our judgment at the door, but bring your empathy. Just leave it. Just come to the conversation with no judgment and be completely empathetic to the person on the other end. I think with those 5 things really can improve listening and create an engaging environment, even with really hard conversations.
I'm doing so much nodding over here in agreement. One of the things that is coming to mind, a few are, and I'll go through them, but the first is a series of statistics about how communication breaks down.
Yeah.
7% of communication is the words we use. Yeah. 38% is our facial expression
body language
is the body language. Yes. 55% is the tone of voice. Which obviously kind of strikes email and Slack only off the charts for for a good conversation. But I think you're bringing up such good points around tone and body language. And I've read a lot of research about how the best salespeople are really amazing at doing what you call mirroring, where they make the body posture, they give positive affirmation with leaning forward or sitting up or asking a question with their eyebrow or, whatever else it is. And I'm glad you're reminding us of those basics, and also just focusing, right? Not having to slap email up. It's that really does break down into what good communication is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, if we're practicing these better listening skills, the other thing we can also do in this environment where you're taking away that 55%, right? I shouldn't say you're taking away the 55% because you do have a little bit of body language that can happen on Zoom. But let's just take Slack, for example, right? We don't have any of that. It's all words. But what we can do in even that environment is we can focus on really being clear, right? In our communication, taking emotion out of it, and just the words that we share are just very clear and concise. That then can help with the communication because there is no kind of reading tone, right? When you leave emotion out or words that symbolize emotion, you leave those words out and you're just being very clear and concise. I think those two kind of skills, if you will, can help even in, a Slack communication and email communication. Make it about the information you're trying to exchange, which the definition of communication is an information exchange. But so often we like to layer in kind of emotion and some of those other things that can kind of cloud what we're trying to communicate. So I think that coupled with the good listening skills really can improve, especially in this remote world that we live in now.
Yeah, I can't tell you how often my eyes will glaze over when I get Slacks that are like paragraphs long.
Right.
And I also think your point about assuming good intent or showing up with empathy is very important there as well.
Yes.
Where maybe someone's communicating something that doesn't feel like it was communicated in the way you would want, but because it's over Slack, it's hard to know. So assuming good intent there it comes into play as well.
And ask questions, right? Yes. If it doesn't, then ask clarifying questions. I can't tell you how many times I've had a situation where I'll read something and I perceive it, right, based on my own experiences, and I read it as I've experienced life, and I ask clarifying questions, and I'll say it in just that fashion. My perception of what you sent me is this. Is that correct? Or can you, maybe clarify for me? There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's showing engagement. It's showing that you care, that you're interested in what the person's trying to communicate, and that you want to understand. So yes, I think that even in written communication, show up assuming good intent. And if you think otherwise, or you read otherwise, your perception is not that, then ask questions.
Yeah, that's basically the reverse way of making sure that the message has landed correctly.
Absolutely, 100%.
What are signals, maybe in Daasity or in other organizations that you've guided over the years, that a business is communicating effectively? Is there anything that you can see? Maybe it's just on Slack, maybe it's in NPS surveys, maybe it's something else, where you as a leader can say to yourself, or listeners can say to themselves, okay, we're doing an okay job.
Yeah, I think there's, it's organization dependent on a certain level, right? Because it depends on kind of how you as an organization drive. Do you drive by OKRs? Do you drive by basic, SMART goal setting? Like, what is your kind of data point, if you will, that you measure the success of the business, right? Or data points, I should say. At Daasity, we do drive by OKRs. So it's really measuring cross-departmental performance. That's really important, because if you've got cross-departmental performance where you can see everyone's moving in the right direction, hitting their goals, doing the things that you've outlined as a company, that's one measurement, right? That kind of tells you, okay, our communication's landing, people are getting it, it's clear. Another piece that we use at Daasity, we use pulse surveys.
Okay.
So we use pulse surveys it depends, it depends on what maybe the topic is at the moment, where we just kind of check in. We check in with employees, we make sure that what we're sharing is understood and is landing. And a third really is, watch Slack. When you post something, like at Daasity, we have a corporate announcements channel. When we post something in there, I always go in and look at how many people have either just, liked it, or those that have commented or asked a question. If it's really low, then what I will always suggest is, let's try another vehicle of communication, right? So let's not just do Slack. Let's also make that a topic of our bi-monthly company meeting, so that we can deliver it, quote unquote, live, on Zoom. People can ask questions live in the moment. That gives another vehicle of communication. Maybe that's not an option for you as a company, maybe it has to just be a video message that comes from the CEO or it comes from another member of the leadership team. You can throw that video up in Slack, see how many people view the video. Those are all things that I think can really signal to us as a business whether we're communicating effectively or not. So lots of different vehicles. And then really at Daasity, I think one of the things that has been so phenomenal is that we have really created this feedback culture, if you will. And what I mean by that is we have created all of these opportunities for employees to give and receive feedback, whether that is our bi-monthly company meetings, our mandatory weekly one-on-ones that all managers have with their direct reports, monthly corporate announcements that get posted in Slack. We've created this cadence that employees can rely on and gives them an opportunity to provide that feedback, ask questions. That's a great measurement of whether or not your communication is landing or not, based on kind of that feedback that you're getting in those different opportunities.
I love how practical those are. So thank you for really making it
Absolutely
something we use every day.
I think that's the power, right? It has to be easy.
Yes,
it has to be easy.
Especially during seasons like now where we're extra in our heads about things that need to happen and could happen, and extra busy with to-dos because our teams are leaner, and it's just extra important to keep it basic. Well, fabulous. Rounding out the conversation with two final questions.
Sure.
Given your amazing background, what is one commonly held belief in people that you really disagree with?
I think it comes down to this is more of I think a perception of individuals that aren't necessarily in HR or people. And that perception is that our role is all about hiring, firing, and onboarding. That's what we do, right? We manage benefits, we payroll, like all of that, though, is tied up in hiring, firing, and onboarding. And in reality, it's such a comprehensive function, and it really is all about the entire employee experience. It's so much more, and it's so much more proactive, right? I feel like there's this stigma within HR that it's a reactive role, that's a reactive group. And it really has made, I think, even in the last 5-10 years, this pivot to being very proactive. It's not to say that we don't have to still focus on those important reactive scenarios and things, right? It's not to say that it's not important that you pay attention, to all of the laws and, all of those things. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it really is a proactive employee experience based role. And people can say all the time, oh, we put employees first. Do you really? Are you really looking at the entire experience, or is it really just about hiring and onboarding and firing?
I was just playing off of what you were saying there. It is a really big trend we've seen, like the rise of people and HR leaders in the organization to much more of a strategic position.
Absolutely.
Particularly, right now when we're all thinking about retention of top talent and, for lack of a better phrase, like optimizing the resources that we have. Like, how do we empower them to be their best selves and also be their most productive selves because we have fewer people on the team? You bring up a really good point about how, sometimes reality and perception, there's a big gap. And I do think there's sometimes a lag between how people, organizations are perceived versus what their role actually looks like today. And I would anticipate that, given another 5 or 10 years, perception and reality will be much closer in terms of
I agree.
their reality. And I think too, the additional scrutiny that boards and investors are giving things like retention and pay transparency right now is just going to further that.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I love what you touched on, and that is that it truly is a strategic role. It is not an administrative tactical role. It is a strategic role at the highest level because of the fact that we literally need to understand the entire business and how everything operates to be able to create that employee experience in a way that's going to be impactful and effective within the organization.
Yeah, it involves needing to understand a lot of different departments, a lot of different psychologies, the business strategy, the business plan, and then somehow combining all of those factors and many, many more things into one cohesive culture and employee experience.
Absolutely. 100%.
Well, this has been amazing, Dawn. As we wrap out, or wrap up rather, what I would say is the most important thing that we can all take from today's conversation?
I would have to say, really having a communication strategy in place. I think we take for granted that communication just happens and you don't have to have a strategy, right? And it couldn't be further from the truth because, as I've mentioned kind of throughout this conversation, there are so many things that you need to think about when you're communicating. Why wouldn't you spend that time up front putting a strategy in place? And what I mean by that is really, like I've mentioned, create that cadence for your team. Set up those weekly one-on-ones, set up, bi-monthly company meetings, set up things that are predictable so that you can then measure if your communication is landing correctly and if you're using the right vehicles for your team to communicate your most important messages. So yeah, I would say make sure that you have a communication strategy in place and you spend the time really working on that and revisit it often, right? Like you're going to have people that come and go, and the culture of the company will likely stay similar, but you'll have some nuances and some changes. And so that means you need to reevaluate how you're communicating. Is it still working? But you can't do that if you don't have a strategy in place.
One of the things that I love about my current HR partner, Ashley is her name, and she's our head of people, is how closely we get to work together as head of marketing and head of people on things like communication strategy. And it is the basics of what you're talking about. It's like, do we have something that's documented? Does the rest of the executive leadership team know about it? What is their feedback on it? And then at what cadence are we communicating or looking at it and seeing if the communication strategy needs to change? And I'm thinking back to some research that I remember was very popular about a decade ago about how so much of a strategy's execution is really begins with just having it documented.
Yeah, if you don't have a plan, then you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants, right? And so in those environments, it's really difficult to execute on anything because you don't have anything to reference. You don't have anything to go back to. And then on the flip side, or on the end of that, it's like, what do you measure against if you haven't documented that plan, right? So how do you know if things are working and that you're being effective? So I agree with you 100%. It's you've got to put the time in to create that strategy and document it, have it in place, and then revisit it often.
I love it. Well, to our audience, we are at the end of today's episode, so don't forget to give us a 5-star rating, and you can email podcast@opencomp.com if you have ideas for topics or guests. And Dawn, thank you so much. This has been really enjoyable.
Thank you. Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.